I want to start us off today by acknowledging that this virtual presentation is taking place throughout the unceded territory of California, which is home to nearly 200 tribal nations. In particular, I am speaking to you from Pomo ancestral land in Hopland, California. And we want to honor and to acknowledge the original inhabitants of the various regions. We encourage you to learn which tribal nations are indigenous to the area you are now living in. And one excellent source of information is Native Land, and we've dropped that link into the chat for you to explore later. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Maren Lender, who is going to introduce our speaker today.
Thanks, Brooke, and welcome everyone. Well, it is a great pleasure of mine to introduce Dr. Cameron Barrows. He is, as Brooke noted, the UC California Naturalist Program's lead scientist. He's also an Associate Research Ecologist with UC Riverside and coordinates the Center for Conservation Biology's Desert Studies Initiative. What I love about Cameron's research is the way he manages to conduct exacting research on entire assemblages of species and across a huge and vast landscape. He's also found some really creative ways to conduct long-term studies, which is so important to understanding community dynamics and the consequences of global change. Cameron is also an experienced California naturalist and climate stewards instructor and engages a diverse array of community members in his field research. So take it away, Cameron, and thank you for being here with us to present.
Thank you, Adina, and good afternoon to all of you. Let's see, I too want to acknowledge the ancestral lands of the Cahuilla where I am, and it's not just ancestral, they still live here and are very active members of our local community. That's where we are right there. I've got a couple of goals here, but one of which is just to perhaps open your eyes to what a desert is like. We work down here in the Colorado Desert, which is the hottest and driest of all of the California deserts. It's the hottest and driest of all of the North American deserts, for that matter. And the perception is usually very similar to what the Oxford Dictionary defines it as, is a place where there's not a whole lot going on. And so we want to talk about that in a way that might open your eyes a little bit to it. This is a map that I use in a lot of my presentations to just do exactly what I told you, is to open your eyes to things. And this is a map that the Nature Conservancy put together probably a couple of decades ago, showing the patterns of biodiversity across the North American continent, or at least the United States portion of the North American continent. And if you look at that, when you see those bumps, green bumps and yellow bumps and red bumps, those are areas of high biodiversity. Biodiversity means lots of species that are found nowhere else except for in that particular region. And to a lot of you might be surprised that the Northeast of the United States has very low biodiversity. So does the upper Midwest, and so does sort of the center of the country. And so when I'm in a group with students in the room, I try to get them to think about this and try to come up with hypotheses as to why this might be. I can tell you that they never get it right. And the reason they never get it right is because it's hard to think in deep time. And in deep time, I'd like you to think of what this region looked like probably 15 or 20,000 years ago. And if you were here, most of those areas that today have low biodiversity were covered in about a mile thick sheet of ice during the last ice age. And so the plants and animals that now occupy those lands where the ice age was at that point are what we would consider almost like weeds, not alien weeds, but weeds in that they follow disturbed areas and move into disturbed areas. And as the glaciers receded, those were very disturbed areas. And so the areas where the glaciers weren't is where you see the highest levels of biodiversity. So the Appalachians, for instance, have the highest level of salamander biodiversity in the world. And that extends all the way down into the Florida Panhandle down there. But if you added all of the biodiversity in the entire US into one place, it wouldn't exceed what we have here in California. And we have something really special. And that is not just the coastal areas, it's not just the central areas, it's the entire state. And I'll point, this is where I'll be talking to, is right there, one of those high points of biodiversity. And it is a desert. And so we want to talk about that a little bit and what that means from the standpoint of climate change. Just to give you a different perspective on that, obviously there's a desert scene on the right, and on the left, a redwoods forest. I used to work up in the redwoods for about 6 years. I lived up in Mendocino County in an old growth Douglas fir and redwood forest. So I know it pretty well. But when you look at the biodiversity of these two regions, I think most of you might immediately say, well, the redwoods, of course, it's green. It's got, you know, all of these layers in it. And so it has high biodiversity. But if you look at that, and this is from the Cal Flora website, you can see that it has a respectable amount of herbs, perennial shrubs, and shrubs and trees. But if you compare that to the desert in a similar geographic area, the desert is substantially more. And there's a lot of reasons for that, which should be a whole nother talk. But I just want you to get this perspective that this is in fact a very, very rich area. It's not something that we should just write off as some of us would. Some of us often hear people say, well, it's just a desert, so why can't we, and then fill in the blank, develop it, put golf courses on it, do whatever we're thinking about doing. It is an amazing high level of biodiversity that I think is not appreciated for a lot of people who don't live in this region. We tested this once. A group of friends of mine got together and said, well, let's look at lizard biodiversity, because lizards are like the coolest animal on Earth. So we wanted to see where the most lizards are in all of North America. And I'm only looking at Western North America because there's, in terms of native lizards, the eastern side of the country doesn't have that many. So we were able to discount that. I went to Big Bend National Park once, and they said they had a brochure that said they had more reptiles than any place else in the country. And so I thought, well, let's test that. So a group of friends of mine got together and we counted all of the species of lizards that occurred in each of those circles. And those circles are based on where there's either a national park or a national monument or a wildlife refuge, places where people have been long enough that they should have been able to catalog exactly how many lizards might be there. And so there's a relatively new national park up here, and this is the Mona Lake area, and this is down Lake Mead area. And the blue dots indicate that there's 10 or less species of lizards that occur there. Still more than almost any of the East Coast in terms of native lizards, but not very many compared to the West. When you look at the green dots, now we're talking somewhere between 11 and 15 lizards. And then if you look at the yellow dots, we're going 15 to 20. And if we look at the orange dots, we're looking at 20 to 29 species of lizards. And then the red dots, which are of course just the 3 of them here, you had to have 30 or more species of lizards. So these two down here in Mexico both have 30 species of lizards. This one, which is where I'm speaking to you from right now, has 33 species. So we have the most lizard species, or most biodiversity when you think of just lizards, of anywhere else in North America, which is, I don't think that that's well appreciated. Here's just an example of some of those lizards, not nearly all 30 of them. This is a better representation. And then I'm showing you this around the triangle. The triangle is supposed to represent a mountain. And part of the reason that we have so many lizards is we have some really large mountains down here. We have 3 peaks that exceed 3,000 meters in height, so over 10,000 feet. And the lizards that I am showing you here, that's not all of them that occur here, it's just the more common ones. And they're distributed basically at the elevation that they would occur. So the southern sagebrush lizard can occur up to about 9,000 feet in elevation, whereas flat-tailed horned lizards and fringe-toed lizards are usually below 100 meters in elevation. So you get a feeling for how these distribute themselves along these mountain slopes, some of which are only found on the lower levels or the flat areas. So a few years back, 11 years back, it looks like, in the journal Science, which is the premier science journal for North America and the United States, there was an article that a friend of mine published with a large number of his colleagues that really talked about the plight of lizard diversity as a result of climate change and what was going to happen to lizards if we don't do anything. There's a lot of reasons to think that lizards would be more sensitive, or reptiles would be more sensitive to climate change than a lot of other species. One is that they don't produce their own heat. They are dependent on the environment for heat. Their activity is dependent on how hot it is. And if it gets too hot, perhaps there's not going to be enough space and time within a 24-hour period for them to forage and get enough food or to find mates and do all of these various things. And so this particular study was focused in central Mexico and basically a tropical and subtropical zone. And they found quite a large decline already. This was, again, 11 years ago, and a large decline that had already occurred. And they projected from that decline that of the species of lizards worldwide, that there might be as many as 20% extinction rate, which is substantial. And so if you project that down to where we are here in the Coachella Valley, we have, as I said, around 33 species. That might be 6 to 7 lizard species in our region would probably go extinct, or at least be extirpated from this region. That's significant. And so it's an important question to look at as to whether or not that projection, that hypothesis, is in fact true. So there is an alternative hypothesis, and this is something that I started developing myself, and then when I started looking in the literature, found out that I wasn't by myself in thinking about the world this way. But I put together this little cartoon and said, well, as climate change happens, if you've got a species in that empty polygon on the right there, and as it gets warmer and warmer, it needs to track its thermal niche, its place where it wants to be. And so what most people have thought about in the past is that it has to get someplace else. And so they are thinking about movement of species, substantial movement of species in many cases, and creating corridors and connectivity between habitats so these species can connect. And so when I started thinking about that in terms of reptiles, I thought, well, most of them can't do that. They can't move fast enough to keep up with the rate of climate change. And so that little arrow is my then a miracle happens hypothesis when it comes to plants, most plants and reptiles. You can imagine that birds can do this pretty easily, and large mammals like deer and bighorn sheep and coyotes and so forth, they can move rapidly, and they would at least have the ability to perceive that if it's too hot for them where they are, they have the ability to understand where they need to go. Reptile would have no idea where to go. They would be at best moved randomly, but they don't have the ability to move far enough to make that work for them. So if that's true, then that hypothesis that I described before is that would explain the high level extinctions that we would expect. But there's another way that the future could happen, and that's something that looks more like this, where there is overlap between where they are now, which is this blue polygon, and where they need to be, which is the empty one over here. And if they are already where they need to be, at least in some level of overlap, this is what we would call a climate refugia. They are already where they need to be. They don't have to move. And once climate change becomes, or it gets too warm and uncomfortable for them here, they can eventually occupy that larger space. But a miracle does not have to happen. They already are where they need to be, at least at some portion of that future habitat. So that's an alternative hypothesis and something to think about as to how things might work. So in what we've been doing and looking around, we've discovered what we think are these climate refugia. So this is a western fence lizard. This is a species almost all of you should be very familiar with. It occurs throughout California. I don't think there's much of anywhere other than the lowest elevations in the desert where this species doesn't occur. So you should know it. If you've seen a lizard and didn't know what it was, there's a pretty good chance that they were in fact western fence lizards. So this yellow polygon, this is Joshua Tree National Park here, and this yellow polygon is where they occur in the park at fairly high elevations within the park at the western edge of the park. Except we found them right here in this one point that you wouldn't otherwise expect them. That might be a climate refugia. Interesting. And so to think about that, during ice ages when it got really cold and wet, the lizards, the high elevation lizards would have occurred at lower elevations, and they could have occurred much lower than they are today. But some of them, as it got warmer and warmer, and we have our current climate, got left behind in what we would again call a climate refugia. And so this is potentially a climate refugia here. The interesting thing about this guy is that he and his relatives have probably been there for at least thousands of years and isolated. And one of the things I noticed when I took this picture is his feet are way oversized. You can look at these front feet here. They're probably about twice as large as you would expect them to look in a normal fence lizard. Here's a picture of a normal fence lizard here, and you can see that they have relatively small front feet there. So why would that be? Well, one of the things is that they now live in a habitat that I'm showing you right now. They live in this palm oasis, and there's perennial water going by here. And so that's why it's cooler, and that's why they can live there. But their whole life is moving up and down these palm trees, and maybe having bigger feet is something that is an adaptation for that new habitat that otherwise they wouldn't have access to in any of their other habitats where they live. Another way to think of this climate refugia, and this is a sidewatch lizard, the other really common species that most of you have seen at one point or another. And this is that mountain again, and this bump that you see here is where sidewatch lizards occur now. But you can imagine that they could be moving up the slope, and as it got warmer, they can continue to move up the slope. But there might be a place somewhere in here that we consider a climate refugia, and that would enable them to live and exist there, even if climate change got worse and worse, which undoubtedly it will. So my objectives, one is to do meaningful science, which means science that people can use, that will help us do a better job of being stewards of our landscape. The other part of this that I'm really passionate about is to foster a community of naturalists, to encourage people to go out and be their own scientists or work with other scientists so they can do that, and expand science literacy. And if nothing else has caught your attention in the last 4 years, there are a lot of people that need more science literacy so we can make better decisions when we hear things on the radio or the television. And then finally, of course, always to do quality science. And the reason I put that there is that sometimes you'll get academic folks who don't think that if you work with volunteers or non-trained scientists that you can do quality science. And I have been collecting data for the last 5 or 10 years that shows that that's exactly not true, that the volunteers that we work with increase the value of science we have. They don't take away from it at all. These just examples. And again, most of the volunteers that we have, our community scientists, have graduated from our California Naturalist class or our Climate Stewards class, one or both of those. Not all of them, but most of them have. And we're out there doing, recording lizards. There's a leopard lizard on this log that everybody's trying to get a picture of here. or they're helping me do surveys along some of the trails that we have out here. And so you'll see that they're not trying to be bandits, but we're doing this during the middle of a pandemic. And so everybody is being safe as they possibly can and wearing masks or maintaining 6-foot separations as we go along the trails. And as we count lizards along the trail, this is an example of how, when we are observing these lizards, and so I'm first in line, and you would expect that I would see more because I'm in the front of the line, and I do. But the second person and the third person and the fourth person and the fifth person also see a lot of lizards. They make important contributions to our overall knowledge of what species are out there and the abundance of those species. So often we have the 5 of us, and I had a couple of instances where we had way more than 5, and I wanted to see how many people did it take before you finally didn't see any more lizards. And this is basically what we came up with. So by myself, this is me by myself, I see about 40% of the total lizards that we see when there are 7, 8, or 9 of us. And you really have to get to 6, 7, or 8 before it really starts leveling off. That means each and every one of these people made an important contribution along the way. And I think this is really, really important to understand that not only does it improve the science, but it helps the volunteers understand how much of a contribution they truly are making. It's not just that they're along for the ride, they're having fun, and we get to talk sciencey sorts of things along the way, but their presence and their contributions on the trail or in wherever we are make a huge difference in terms of how good the science is that we ultimately are able to do. So a lot of work we do is in Joshua Tree National Park, which is this polygon right here. The Coachella Valley is right here. Palm Springs is about right here. For those of you who have spent a spring break here, the Coachella Festival is probably about right here somewhere in case you're into music. And then this is the Santa Rosa and San Jacinto National Monument, which is also one of the areas that we do a lot of work. So I wanted to start out with just a group of the lizards that we work with, and this is in Joshua Tree National Park. And this is a group including 2 different species of horned lizards. This is Blainvilles horned lizard and desert horned lizard. This Sidewatch Lizard, that's a real beautiful male in his breeding colors, and the zebra-tailed lizard here. Western whiptail, Western fence lizard, which we've met already, and then this is the desert spiny lizard. And at one point, about 5 or 6 years ago, I got an email from a colleague when I did my master's degree at Long Beach State. And he said, we've got this box of data cards and we don't know what to do with them. We're going to throw them out, but that says Joshua Tree on the side. And we wanted to know if I wanted it. And I said, sure, send them out. Turned out to be location cards for lizards that people during the 1950s and 60s went out there as part of class field trips, and they recorded every location for every lizard they saw. Of course, they didn't have GPS units back there, so you have to be careful about exactly how close they were to describing the right location. But what they did do is they recorded by 1/10 of a mile where they were along a road when they saw whatever lizard they saw. And so I was able to then go back and convert all of their observations to global positioning satellite or GPS coordinates and compare those to where those same lizards occur today. So we have a data set that goes from the 1950s to the end of the 60s. And then we have another data set that's in the 2015 to 2020. We can compare that. And so this is what it looks like. And so the black bars are where the people in the 50s and 60s saw them. The white bars are where we see them today. And so this is the fence lizard, for instance, and you can see that the white bars are bigger as you get to higher elevation. So this is low elevation to higher elevation. Same thing with the desert spiny lizard. White bars are more prominent and higher at the higher elevations. Black bars was where they used to be. And so you can see that the highest abundance that they found them in the 50s and 60s was at relatively low elevations. Now we're seeing them mostly at the high elevations. Same thing for the fence lizard. So this is the desert horned lizard, same thing right here. I'm sorry, this is the desert horned lizard. And in this case, the desert horned lizard is actually moving into areas that it never was before. And so this is the, and then a miracle happened hypothesis that are actually moving into new areas. This is the Blainvilles horned lizard down here. So anyway, you get a feeling that in that intervening period, something changed. The lizards moved up the mountain. And every single species moved up the mountain at least a little bit, and in some cases quite a bit. And if you look at every other possibility, the only thing that makes sense at this point is that it got warmer. And not only did it get warmer, but it got much more arid. And aridity is really the key here. As the world gets warmer, even if the rainfall stays the same, it's going to get drier because there's going to be higher levels of evaporation. So the desert never gets a lot of rain to begin with. But when it gets warmer, whatever rain we get has much less of an impact in terms of plant growth because it evaporates. And so it can't contribute to that plant growth and insect growth and ultimately lizard growth if it evaporates. And so that's what seems to be happening right here. We compared that just to as a way of looking at it to say, using the current data, where and starting in 2014 when we collected data to 2019, are there shifts even during that period? And the darker bars are the higher elevations, the lighter bars are the lower elevations. And you can see in every single case, they are shifting, their abundance is shifting to those higher elevation sites, even in the last 5 or 6 years that we've been watching them. So climate change is having not only an impact, but a very rapid impact on where these species can occur within the environment. So now I'm going to shift down here to the National Monument for some other work that we're doing down there. And here, this is the National Monument again. Palm Springs is about right here. The Coachella Festival is about right here when they have it. And I divided the landscape into 3 spots. This is the hottest and driest, most arid. This is a sort of a medium area. And then Palm Springs tends to be, relatively speaking, again, this is a desert, but relatively speaking, cooler and much, much wetter, much less arid. And so just comparing those 3 sites. And so we have a eastern, a central, and a western region. And you can see this is the chuckwalla, which is a large vegetarian lizard. In the eastern region, very, very few chuckwallas until you get to the highest elevations, and then not very many. In the western region, and the other thing I want to point out here is observed is what we saw. The dark bars are expected, which means that's how much trail space was available for them to be in. But again, we found them mostly at these higher elevations and not at all at the lower elevations, even in the central region. And then if you look at the western region, that wetter region, you can see the observed is very high, even at the lowest elevation. The only difference is this one, and this is because there was an invasive grass that took over this elevation. But everything else, the lizards occurred at higher levels than were expected for their elevation, except for where the invasive plant was. So again, climate change is the best, easiest, or most parsimonious explanation to explain these patterns that we're seeing here. This is the Sidewatch Lizard again, and the same sort of thing. I do want to go back a little bit here. I found a narrow canyon at a very low elevation, and the chuckwallas were very high densities in there. And so that's a climate refugia because they are able to hang out in high density, even though anywhere else they can't, even until they get up to more higher elevations here. The reason for that is it's in a narrow canyon that concentrates water. And so from this, we can say that it's not temperature by itself, but it's really aridity. And so if you're concentrating water in a wash or along a river or a canyon bottom, you can have higher levels of water than you would expect if you were on a ridge or on just an open slope. And so this is the open slope condition, and this is the narrow canyon. And so again, this is what we believe is a climate refugia. So same thing here. There was not a lot more, but a few more of the sidewatch lizards in that same refugia here. And the numbers get higher and higher at these higher elevations in every situation, except for this wet one where even at the lowest elevation, the sidewatch lizards were very, very common down there. So again, we're meeting with our expectations in terms of what climate change should be doing to these populations. Then we went to some high elevation areas to say, well, so if that's what's happening at the bottom of their range, what's happening at the top of their range? So here's the sidewatch lizard. And now we're talking about 5,000 to 6,000 feet elevation along a trail. It's called the Spittler Peak Trail. And we're right at the very top level of where sidewatch lizards could occur. And this was a 7 or 8 year period that we were doing surveys. And again, this is all with the community scientists, the volunteers, along with me. You can see that the first few years, we barely found any of them. And then all of a sudden their population exploded. And so they're climbing up the mountain. The Western whiptails don't seem to be doing a whole lot. Western fence lizards also right at the edge of their range. And now they're climbing up the mountain. So even in this 8, 9, 10 year period, we're able to see these changes happening. Granite spiny, not so much change. And the southern sagebrush lizard is already a high elevation species, so not as much change there as well. You can see these are those two highest elevations. This is the granite spiny right here, which is otherwise found all the way down through Baja, but up here in its range, it loves these high elevations. And the males, when they're in breeding condition, are just gorgeous with this cobalt blue and turquoise color. And this is the southern sagebrush lizard, one that you would otherwise find only in the mountains. These guys are doing just fine at the high elevations. They don't seem to be moving much at all. I'm going to end up this talking about some of the species that are, or at least one of the species that occurs only at the lowest elevation. So this is the Coachella Valley fringe-toed lizard. It is a state endangered species, only occurs in sand dunes. That's it, all of its adaptations are to restrict it to a sand dune. So it doesn't have the option to move up a mountain. It can't climb the mountain to get to a cooler or at least a less arid place. It's stuck on the sand dune. That's it. That's its only option right now. So there's a lot of concerns that this might be the climate change will have a very negative impact on species that are restricted to the valley bottom or to the sand dune areas. Again, here's the Coachella Valley, again, Palm Springs here, Coachella's down there. This is the Santa Rosa and San Jacinto Mountains. San Jacinto Peak is about right there, and Joshua Tree is over here. And if we were to be able to go back in time, we would see that there was a sand dune system that occupied almost the entire Coachella Valley floor, about 100 square miles of sand dunes. That was then, and that was when the Cahuilla Indians were the sole inhabitants of this species, of this region. Since European or non-Indian people have come here, it's changed quite a bit, as you can imagine. It's 300 golf courses or over 300 golf courses. Each golf course is using 1 million gallons of water a day. It's the most obscene landscape you can imagine in terms of protecting biodiversity. And of that 100 square miles of sand dunes, there's just a few patches left. In each and every one of these patches, the fringe-toed lizard still is maintaining healthy populations. Not sure how to explain that other than maybe we haven't gotten to their tipping point yet. We haven't gotten to the point where it's too arid, it's too dry for them to maintain populations. But we find them in each and every one of these patches here, and they seem to be maintaining sustainable populations, at least to this point. We did find, if you were to look at that original population, all of the fringe-toed lizards were the same genetic type. There wasn't any different from one end of the valley to another in terms of their genetics. Since we've fragmented this habitat and broken it into these relatively small patches, each and every one of these patches is now genetically distinct. And it's an interesting argument that not an argument, I should say, it's an interesting discussion I've been having with my colleagues that are geneticists, because they would say, we need to start moving lizards around to get them back to their original condition where all then all of them were the same. And I said, well, maybe, but the alternative hypothesis here is that these guys have become really well adapted to this really hot, dry area. And these guys are really adapted to a cooler, wetter environment. And if we start mixing them together, we're not doing them any good. So we're having that discussion, and I think it's a real interesting discussion, but it could mean that there's actual adaptation happening to these species living in a hotter and drier environment than they originally evolved in. And I think that, to me, is really interesting. So I'm finishing up. This is my last slide. I wanted to open it up for questions here, but lizards are shifting, they're adapting, and they're persisting in apparent climate refugia in response to levels of warming, and increased aridity that they've experienced so far. So that's the interesting part of this. And it's not just lizards. We're seeing the same thing with lizards. Plants. We're seeing the same thing with birds. We're seeing it across the board in terms of the biodiversity of the desert here. The hope here is that we still have a window of opportunity to halt and reverse climate change trajectory, because these mountains are not infinite in their size. If the lizards and the plants and everything else can only move so far up the mountain until they get to the top. One of the lizards that I mentioned a little bit, the Blainvilles horn lizard, occurs in Joshua Tree National Park, but Joshua Tree doesn't have high elevations like some of these other places I've mentioned. Their highest elevation is just barely 6,000 feet compared to well over 10,000 feet in some of these other areas. And the Blainvilles horn lizard is already right at that 6,000 foot level. If it gets any hotter or drier, it's going to get pushed right off the top and have a local extinction event. And as it gets warmer and drier and continues in that trajectory, that will happen to more and more species as they get up to their limits and get pushed off the top of the mountain. So we have an opportunity here, and that's what the Climate Stewards class is all about, is to try and encourage people to be better stewards of our environment from a climate standpoint, but also be an activist and to stand up for the lizards and the plants and the insects and everything else out there, as well as each other, because as climate change affects each and every one of the species I've mentioned, it's affecting us as well. That's all I have. I think I finished just as when I said I would. So Adina, if you want to open it up for questions, please go ahead.
Hope you can hear us all clapping. Thank you so much. Wow. So much in your talk to digest and appreciate. And I love the participation by all the naturalists, and that you quantified how much they contribute to your knowledge base. And that's one thing you've written about too, Cameron. It's just really, really valuable that you think about those things as well as your lizard data. But what is the role that others are doing and how is it contributing? It's very, very powerful. Thank you. All right, I'm going to turn it over to questions that we've received from the audience. The first question that came up is it possible, Cameron, that the observers you work with and yourself possibly, I don't know, I'm including you as a primary observer, are just getting better over time at finding the lizards? Maybe reflecting on that sort of 2014 to 2020 data set or something. Where
Right. It's possible. So just to give you a, for instance, the group of community scientists that I work with is an evolving group. And so there's always new people joining it. There's always people that are sort of deciding that they're either going to move to some place that's cooler and wetter than the desert, or their knees or their hips are giving out on them and they can't do the same things that we're doing. And so I mean, this is a really very good question, but most of the folks, when they start out, can't identify which lizards they're seeing. All they can do is say, Dr. Barrows, there was a lizard. And I walk back and say, okay, that's what it was. And so the only thing they're initially good at is seeing that there was something there. They usually can't identify what species it is until over time and eventually they develop those skills. So I think that it's a good question, but I think that we have done a pretty good job of correcting for that. We've, again, the folks back in the 50s and 60s that were doing this, they were spending as much time out there as we were. So they were developing the same skills.
I suppose you could even look at this for yourself, because you've had many years before you started that shorter study, right, Cameron? So you're 40% of the data. You could see if that's the same trend, but it is hard to differentiate.
Yeah.
The question is, what can we do to make our own spaces around our homes more reptile friendly? And is it different from like other habitat features? I think the person's asking, for instance, if they're thinking about birds or bees or butterflies.
So the things that you will do for birds and bees and butterflies will be really good for lizards, because you're providing them the food that they need there. I've tried really hard to make my yard as lizard friendly as possible. And I've got probably, as I'm talking to you, about a dozen sidewatch lizards and a few desert spiny lizards on the wall behind me that I can see right now. The thing that's different that you would want to add for lizards is cover. So you want the flowers, you want the pollinators, you want native plants as much as you can incorporate native plants, but you also need to create cover, because lizards are food for a lot of other things, whether it's house cats or roadrunners or kestrels or whatever you've got in your yard. They want to eat lizards, and so you have to provide cover for them. And so I've got piles of boulders and things like that I create cover for my lizards. In an area where you don't have a lot of lizards, then maybe create a brush pile or something like that the lizards can get into. And at least, I don't mean to say that we don't want to feed the kestrels and the roadrunners, and probably don't want to feed the house cats, but
great, thank you. That sounds like a good tip, and I hadn't thought about it. The other question that came up, and you mentioned an invasive grass, I believe, in one of your study sites, and this person asks, are there invasive species, and why, and what can be done to eradicate them?
Yeah, well,
is that advisable? I mean, is that sort of something you work on?
It is another part of the research that I do. Most of the research I focus on is to identify the impact of the invasive species, and then help other people who are smarter than I am figure out how we're going to get rid of them. One of the things that when I first came to the Coachella Valley in the desert, I was told by one of the professors at UC Riverside that the tumbleweed, tumbleweed, which is an invasive plant, is terrible and we have to get rid of it. That's the worst thing that's happening right now. And as I went out and started looking at the tumbleweed and figuring out what could be done, I would dig up a tumbleweed, and almost every time, not every time, but almost every time I do that, there would be a fringe-tailed lizard underneath it. Well, this is interesting. And I did this over and over again and realized that the tumbleweeds were actually providing cover and they were providing shade. And then so I said, well, so I'm thinking about this too much of a lizard-centric person. I should think about it from the biodiversity of the whole site. But then I realized that insects were attracted to the tumbleweeds. And so there was more insects there. And so what about the native plants? Well, the tumbleweeds were never so dense that they weren't allowing the native plants to get there. And so we destroyed or altered 95% of the sand dunes to create habitat for people, mostly golf courses and things like that. Leaving the tumbleweeds there didn't seem to be such a bad idea. And it turns out the tumbleweeds come and go on their own schedule. And sometimes I can't find a tumbleweed out there, and other times there's a lot of them, but they never detract from the biodiversity. They always either help or are benign. But that's not true for all the weeds out there.
Maybe we should be thinking more about these invasive golf courses. And two people have asked about that. There's probably others too in this line of questions for you. Are they adding so much water to the system that the humidity increases locally? I mean, you mentioned the water drawdown, which is coming probably from, drying of neighboring areas. And somebody also asked they take up so much land in the first place. That's not helping. And I just want to tile on to this question, Cameron. This issue that I'm not sure if are all your low elevation sites relatively undisturbed and protected, because I would imagine there's the whole driver of the kind of local land use disturbance that confounds your looking at the local extirpation of in the lower elevations. So maybe you can talk about how you deal with that in your design.
So there was probably 3 or 4 questions loaded into that whole statement. The statistic I gave you before is that each golf course uses about 1 million gallons of water a day, and there are 310 golf courses, so that's 310 million gallons of water per day. And it's all being, not all of it, but probably close to 80 to 90% of it is being pumped out of the ground. So it's fresh water. It's basically Pleistocene water. It's some of the best tasting water in California, actually. And they're using it to do this and to make golf courses. So the golf courses do occupy a huge amount of area. They are used by a relatively few number of people. It costs for some of the golf courses in the Coachella Valley, it costs $200 to $300 a day to play golf. So not everybody can do that on a regular basis, obviously. And so we're dealing with a fairly narrow group of people. And in the last probably 5 or 6 years, and I sort of attribute it to Tiger Woods and his sort of downfall in terms of what has happened in his celebrity status, is that golfing has become less and less interesting to young people than it was before. And so these golf courses were building in anticipation that it was going to be a sport that was growing and growing and growing. And it hasn't happened that way. But average person who plays golf is in their 70s and they're aging out of the system. And there's not a lot of young people that are coming behind them. Not enough to keep the golf courses funded. And so a lot of these golf courses are saying, well, what's the alternative? And there are some conservation groups, there's one in particular that is going around trying to buy the golf courses and then convert them back to natural habitat. So they're creating mesquite habitat or riparian habitat or any number of different habitats. And this is something that's just starting, and it's a brand new idea. And people are really getting excited about it because it's an opportunity to do something that takes something that was not helpful to most people. It was, I'm sure golf is fun for those people who are good at it. I'm not, I've never tried it, but for most people who live here, it's not a sport that you have really an option to play because it's very, very expensive sport to play.
Right.
So
it's
they're
very
opening it up to people.
I'm going to jump in, Cameron, because we have so many questions, but it's heartening to know that people are trying to do some restoration, and great point about recreation. Can you maybe stop sharing your slides, Cameron, and we'll be more able to see everyone as we sort of come to a close together. Great.
Sorry.
And that's okay. There's more questions that we have time for. So I'm going to ask for apologies in advance to everyone on this. But there was one that I think everyone would enjoy hearing, which is, I know you've worked on many different species, but you do have a good body of work on herpetofauna. And I'm wondering, somebody asked, what attracted you to the lizards?
That's a good question. So I started with birds. I was talking with Brooke a little bit before we were starting that was sort of the first 10 or 20 years of me being a scientist was working on birds and specifically working on spotted owls, and was one of the first people in California to do the work that helped us understand why they need old growth forest. And it's not that they care about big trees, it's because they are severely affected by climate issues, and the old growth forests are substantially cooler than a second growth forest or any other type of forest that you can imagine. And so that's the finding of the work that I did in those first 10 or 20 years. But my frustration in that was that I was always dealing with an individual pair here and here and here, but I was never able to sort of wrap my head or my arms around the idea of a population and what's happening at a population level. And when I started thinking about, well, maybe I should be dealing with smaller birds. Well, they're so mobile and they're moving around all the time, it's still really hard to get your arms around or your head around the idea of what is a distinct population in any bird species or at all. So when I came to the desert, I started thinking about it, and at least for the lizards, I could conceptualize and think about a population for the first time in my career. And that was very exciting to think about. This is what a population is doing, not just individuals, not just a pair here or a pair there, but the whole population is responding to climate change or to invasive species or whatever the situation might be. And to me, that was really exciting.
I love that answer. Basically, lizards don't fly.
Right. Lizards don't fly.
That's awesome. And I just want to, I know we got to jump to Brooke. She's going to close us out. But right before Brooke, if you have any thoughts, are we okay? Okay.
Yeah, we're fine. I need like 1 minute, 2 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, great. So Cameron, one thing that came up that's been interesting, I think, for California naturalists, and I know you think a bit about, is traditional ecological knowledge and the value of indigenous stewardship. Do you have any thoughts, maybe collectively around the entire institute that you're working with or your center there in Riverside, regarding what enhancements could be put in place to sort of enrich the capacity for that type of approach?
Sure. Well, the thing that comes immediately to mind doesn't apply specifically to deserts, but it applies to almost everywhere else in California, and that's fire. And our fire cycles are, by and large, completely out of whack right now. And if we think back to the native indigenous use of fire, they were much more enhancing biodiversity by their fire use and protecting basically the diversity of animals and plants out there, maintaining the diversity of habitats, something that we don't do anymore because we're either trying to stop fire, or when we do have fire, the fires are so large. And so to the extent that we can start thinking about fire as a kuya would have been, or a chumash, or any of the indigenous people thought about fire before, I think we would benefit California's biodiversity tremendously. And that's something that my group is thinking about a little bit, but I think other folks are thinking about a lot more.
Wonderful, thanks. I think I do want to just close that out based on the questions that we have and turn it over to Brooke. If she has a pressing question and wants to that I've missed or something, feel free, Brooke. And thank you again, Cameron. It's just been a delight to hear from you today. And Brooke, of course, for organizing the Cone series, and everyone for making time to be together. But stay here because Brooke's got some announcements.
Yeah, so thank you, Dr. Barrows, Dr. Marenlander. Really great information, and it's nice to see everyone. Thank you all for participating today. We'll be sending the recording link shortly, and we hope to see you again. We really want to hear your thoughts about today's presentation and your ideas moving forward with the series. We've got a nice lineup set up, and we've used a lot of your suggestions to set that lineup. So thank you very much. I've put the evaluation link in the chat. Registration is open for the rest of the spring lineup. If you can't make a presentation, that's fine. You can always just register to receive the link on our YouTube channel after the presentation. April is National Citizen Science Month, and April 13th, we will be welcoming Dr. Mara Palacios Mejia. She is a California naturalist and a Howard Hughes Medical Institute postdoc scholar at UCLA. And she's going to talk to us about the Cal-eDNA program and transforming how we view community science. And then CalNat's own Sarah Angulo will also be talking about ways that you can get involved with the upcoming City Nature Challenge at the end of this month. And we have a lot of California naturalists that are involved with that. So we'll probably be doing a little bit of organizing around that at the end of that. So don't miss that on April 13th. And then on May 25th, we'll be hosting UC A&R's Dr. Faith Kearns, and she's going to be discussing her new book called Getting to the Heart of Science Communication. And with that, it's great to see everyone. Thank you so much. And we hope to see you next time on April 13th.